All right. So one thing that we can think about that plays a role with competitive balance in these leagues is something called the invariance principle. So this is the idea that it doesn't matter who starts out with the property rights to something, the person who values it the most is going to be the one who ends up kind of possessing the good, right? So for this, mostly we can think about like players, right? Whatever team values a player the most, that should be the team that player ends up on. So I can put in some to stay put. There we go. So you can kind of think about if we had this free and open market, and I'll draw a picture in a second here, and we just set a single price for these tickets. If there's a secondary market, it doesn't matter who ended up with that one ticket, they're going to try to sell it to someone who values it more, right? Kind of leading into our discussion leading in today. Like if I had a ticket, right, if I don't value it as much as somebody else, there's an amount we could agree on where I'd be willing to give up my ticket for that price, they'd be willing to pay it, right? So it doesn't matter who starts out with a ticket, the person who values the most will be the one who ends up with that ticket. So if we think about this in terms of like sporting events tickets, like a lot of times they'll give these out like in a lottery, or they're worried about, they've got such a high demand, but they want to kind of be fair to make sure that people have the opportunity to the game. Sometimes like in a lottery, I think IU does this with their tickets, and there's some other high demand things where they start issuing them out with a lottery. Excuse me. And it doesn't matter who wins that lottery, right? Because if there's a resale market, as long as there's someone who values it more than them, they could turn around and sell it for more, right? And the person who values the most will then end up with it, right? So we're going to go through an example here in a second visually. The one way that this can break down is if we have high transaction costs. So I'll think about two different types of examples, one with the ticket market, and then we'll think about another one if we think about players, right, here in just a second. So let me see if I can. There we go. So let's look at a ticket market. So let's just say we're looking at, actually, let me zoom in just a little bit more here. So let's say we're looking at a representative consumer, right? So these are kind of, how many tickets, or sorry, this is our market demand. So this is how many tickets. And let's say, and just for the sake of this example, we're below capacity, but it doesn't necessarily matter. So I've got my twice as steep marginal revenue curve. And I can identify kind of what price the monopolist would set if they're setting a single price, right? So let's say it just so happens, right, that there's a lottery system, right? So that anybody who has any demand here could end up with a ticket, right? So instead, this person might not be willing to pay that single price that the monopolist set, but they would have paid, some amount, right? And just somehow through the lottery, right? Maybe it was, if they set a single price instead of using this lottery, they could have set a much higher price. They didn't. They're trying to be fair. And so somehow in this lottery, this person ends up with a ticket, right? I don't know. We could think about they would have paid maybe $10, right? Well, that means that if they got the ticket, there's someone up here who didn't get that ticket, all right? Well, if this person valued that ticket at, say, $30, as long as there's a resale market, we could agree to any price between 10 and 30, this person would be willing to sell because their benefit is now greater than, what they're giving up. You kind of think about now when they sell the ticket, their cost is the value of the ticket to them. Well, the value of the ticket is only $10. So for this person, right, any price that he can agree on with this other person, as long as it's over 10, he has a net positive payoff. And this person up here, they value the ticket at $30. So if they can agree to a price that's below $30, they're going to be net, their net benefits greater than zero. So as long as we kind of have a resale market, we'll see that the invariance principle kind of always gets the ticket to the person who values it the most. Okay? Now, how could this break down? So let's say, I can give a good example of this here in a second, but let's say that for whatever reason, we agree to this price of 20, right? So for the first person, we can kind of think about, okay, the price that we set was 20 minus 10, right? So they have a net benefit of 10. This person also has kind of this net benefit of 10. But let's say to resell this ticket, I'm operating through a third party who charges me a fee, right? And for the sake of this example, to make this make sense, we'll say it's like kind of a ridiculous fee, but it's just a flat fee of $20. Well, that's a problem, right? Because now if I've got to pay a fee of $20, my cost is not just giving up the ticket, but it would be giving up the ticket as well as whatever I have to pay this outside party or this third party to resell my ticket. Now, right, I've got a negative net benefit if I sell the ticket on this third party, right? And then for the other person, you know, you can kind of think about even if we operate it through where we charge them the fee, same kind of idea. Doesn't matter if we charge the person purchasing the ticket on the third party or the person selling it, it's charged the dollar or the money to sell on the third party. We're going to see that now neither one of them want to agree to this deal, right? You know, not good for me to sell the ticket, not good for me to buy it. Right? So if we have these high transaction costs or these third-party fees get too large, you can actually see where it breaks down some of the invariance principle. So we like to think that it, you know, mostly takes over, it mostly is at work. But if there are fees, so using these resale or these third parties, right, then potentially there are going to be some transactions that could be kind of canceled, right, by these higher transaction costs. Is that any questions on that? The other one that we could kind of think about is if I want to look at instead a labor market. So let's say I've got wages here. Let's say there's demand from, I don't know, team 1, and then we would have a lower demand for team 2. Here's my labor supply. And I can kind of think about, okay, let's say, I don't know, let's do, we'll just kind of say this is going to be 2 different teams, right? One of them has a much higher demand for this player for whatever reason. You know, maybe it's like the type of player. So this could be an example like, oh, it's a recent one I just heard about. So this could be like Kyrie Irving, right? He's going to fit in differently with different teams. So he's going to have a different value to different teams, right? So maybe there were some teams who had much higher value for him than others, right? For whatever reason, let's assume that this player is currently on team 2, right? They're currently on a team where they're not valued very much by that organization for their skill set for whatever reasons, right? They're not going to produce as many wins for that team. It doesn't matter if they start out on that team, because what's going to happen if there's a team out there who says, well, look, he's only currently being paid $5 million by this other team. As long as, you know, once his contract's up, I'd be willing to pay $10 million for them. So we can come up with a trade, let's say, where we trade this player. This team is willing to take any amount over $5 million, right? This team is willing to pay any amount up to $10 million. So I'm going to have this range where I know that they could agree to a trade, right? And once they agree to a trade, this player, right, is always going to end up with the team that values them the most. Just like the ticket will end up with whoever values it the most. Now, let's say we've got, agreed to a price or a trade price of $7.5 million, right? We'll trade this player to you. His benefit to us right now, his marginal benefit to us is $5 million, right? If we trade them to you and we get 7.5, well, then that team is willing to trade for that player or trade that player away. The team that's trading for the player, they're going to get $10 million of marginal benefit, right? That's how valuable that player is to that team. Once he's there, they had to give up $7.5 million. They're still net positive as well. And then we can go through the same type of example. What if we have transaction costs, right? What if these trades are costly in terms of, oh, I don't know. You could think about just dealing with the agents involved and that there's some additional costs in trying to come together to agree to trade this player. Well, it could break that down, right? Now, I don't think there's like the ticket one's a little bit more likely that we have these really high transaction costs or using this third party. In the trade situations, I mean, you could argue that there's really not a lot of additional transaction costs, and that the invariance principle probably holds up a little bit more in these player examples as opposed to like the ticket market example, right? Questions on that idea before we keep moving? Yeah.
Just like if the net benefit was 0, would that mean that we
would say they're indifferent, right? That it could occur, could not. They're indifferent either way. Yeah, let's say they agree to I don't know, let's say they agree to a price of 10 million. Well, we know that this person's going to want to do it. This person would be indifferent, or team. I say person, this team would be indifferent. Any other questions for me? All right. So let's go back to the slides here. Oops. So we can kind of think about this is, if we have free agency, if we have true free agency, then whatever team is willing to pay that player the most is going to be the one that ends up with them, right? Without free agency, right? So it doesn't matter, if we go back to the reserve clause days, right? So the reserve clause days was the only way you get to another team is if you get traded. With free agency, it's easy, right? Once your contract's up, they just go to the team that's willing to pay them the most. But the example that I was kind of working through was under this idea of like almost like the reserve clause, right? Somehow this player was on this other team who didn't value them as much, right? So even without free agency, if we still allow for trading, we still end up with the team that values that player the most would pay the most for them, right? Or give up the most in trade value. So that, I guess, is an argument of why the reserve clause and kind of giving these teams monopsony power, which would then decrease wages. Potentially that breaks down because if you still have the availability to trade, I can still, other people are going to value me higher. There's still going to be a market for which I can get traded and paid higher wages, right? Excuse me. But, right, because of that monopsony power, yeah, you could still see that player end up on the team that valued them the most. It's just that instead of that player getting higher wages, potentially some of that money just goes to the team, right? So we have the reserve clause. We still end up with the invariance principle holding. It's just that the players don't benefit, the teams will. So one thing that could break this down, and we'll get a little bit of an idea of this in here in just a second, but what if I had luxury taxes where like I might value that player the most, but given the amount of money I'm currently spending, if I trade for that player, I'm going over this kind of cap that the league is set, where I said, look, if you spend any more money on player salary from this amount, you have to pay, a certain percent, right? You have to pay kind of a luxury tax to the league, right? So for every dollar you give this player past this cap, you have to give, to pay us 50 cents or something like that. Well, now you've essentially increased the cost of that player, right? You've added some kind of like transaction costs, and you can see that invariance principle breakdown. So just like the third party example we said where they were charging a $20 fee, if the league started to charge you a certain amount of luxury taxes when you go over this cap trading for this player, even though you valued that player the most, that luxury tax could prevent you from ending up with a player breaking down that invariance principle. Okay. Does that make sense there? Kind of the connection to the ticket price example. Yeah.
There be any way to like show their preference like as a player, like wins versus like salary? Like some people take a pay cut or a certain amount.
Yeah. Yeah, whatever. It's a good question. So I'll answer it. So you can think of basically what you're describing. If we've got this labor market and we've got some demand curve for labor, some supply curve. And your question was, if a team, is there a player, how would I put in player preferences, right? So let's say this is team one, and then this would be kind of like equilibrium wage, right? If there's another team out there that if this player went there, they would, if they care more about wins, right? There could be another team for which to get the exact same amount of labor, right? They'd be willing to do so at a much lower wage, right? To supply their labor to that team, they would take less money because they value winning more, right? And to figure out, you could break down the indifference curve of, that very specific player, but that's how it would play out, right? If they care more about wins, going to the team that has a higher chance of winning, I'd supply my labor at a lower wage to them, right? Because I'm sacrificing money to get additional wins. So kind of think about here. Here would be my supply curve for labor for that second team, right? And we'll even here, I've assumed, let's just keep demand the same. Let's say these two teams value that player the exact same amount. Well, that player, the equilibrium wage they would take on that second team, they would take a lower amount. And what's kind of interesting here too, right? We would kind of see a increase in labor hours. So this gets kind of weird. Oh, sorry, this is one. How do we think about this in terms of, all right, this player would be willing to play more games at a lower wage for that team if they had a higher chance of winning? Well, instead, think about this as like the number of games. When we're measuring the quantity of labor, it starts to get a little bit tricky. We could think of this as like the number of players. Like if there's some players who just want to win more, this would reflect that more of those players are going to choose to be on that second team, right? And they're going to choose to use at a lower wage. You would also think about it as individual players, right? So this could represent the supply curve of one player. And how can you say, well, you got to supply all the games, right? So isn't supply kind of fixed? We can think about these labor hours as in like quality labor hours. So even if I'm playing the same number of games, I'm going to supply a different level of effort, right? So it gets a little bit harder to measure the quantity of labor, but we would expect it to go up. Well, what does that mean if we're thinking about quantity of labor in terms of like the effort hours put in? Players are willing to put in more effort at lower wages on these teams if all they care about is winning, or if they care more about winning, I should say, not all about winning. Is that kind of what you were asking? All right, that's a good question. So thinking about labor supply kind of shifting, really just kind of preferences, right? If I value something else about that team, well, that lowers my kind of marginal cost. I'm willing to supply my labor at lower wages. Right? What else do I want to do? So I think I kind of already worked through this one with a ticket example. So that slide kind of just goes along with that. So we can think about free agency and kind of how this is going to impact. We just talked about its relationship to the invariance principle. Wait, did I just repeat this? Yes, I did. Sorry, this was the exact same slide. All right. And then we've got revenue sharing. So I want to do one little thing with revenue sharing, and then we're going to talk about salary caps and salary maximums, minimums. Also kind of work in how we look at that luxury tax impacting teams targeted with. So this is all stuff I think is a copy paste of another slide that we had when we talked about revenue sharing before, right? So we said these big market teams, they're still going to have this higher relative marginal revenue, right? But when we have this revenue sharing with percentage based, and this is something I've grading the first homework, I notice is maybe a little bit lost, is that when we have revenue sharing, it's not increasing these small market teams' demand and marginal revenue curves. Right? Anytime you take a percent of revenue, you can think about this as whatever my demand curve was before, right? So I'll just draw this for one team here. So let's say I had my demand marginal revenue curve, right? If I just want to think about it, because I think it's a little easier in terms of revenue, what's happened when now 50% of my broadcast revenue has to go to the league, or 39% of my concessions revenue, whatever it is, right? And here, I think in like the homework assignment, I assumed that the small market team didn't have any in one of the problems. But let's assume for whatever we're looking at, whatever revenue is being shared, every team makes something, right? Now, we know our large market teams will generate more revenue than our small market teams, but every team's getting something. So once I take a certain percent of it, I'm no longer keeping each dollar. I'm only keeping 70%, right? So I'm going to see this reduction, and you kind of think about it in my marginal revenue curve. If you want to, you can think about, yeah, I'm going to have this new demand curve as well, right? After I'm taking a portion of this revenue. But this occurs for both teams. So this happens for the large market team, but it also happens for the small market team. I guess I should have labeled these over here a little better. So these are our large market teams, right? This is after kind of the revenue sharing. Now, for our small market, they're also going to see a shift, but it's not going to be near as large, right? Because 50% of 10 million is a lot less than 50% of 500 million, right? So we're going to see them both shift, right? It's just that the larger market shift is going to be a little bit larger, bringing that targeted number of wins closer together. I think I might have went over this slide, but I really wanted to kind of hammer this home after kind of what I saw, just kind of looking at some of those homework results. Right? So we also talked about, this really only matters, right? This kind of idea of revenue sharing can only improve competitive balance. How much it will improve competitive balance depends on the behaviors of the teams, right? If they're profit versus win maximizing. In the most extreme case, in that one homework assignment, I said, look, let's assume that the small market team makes absolutely no revenue, so they're not paying in at all. What would that look like? Well, let's draw this right below. We can kind of see how even in a revenue sharing program, thinking about a very extreme case where the small market teams don't have to pay anything in, right? So we might think, well, this is going to be great, right? This could definitely improve competitive balance a lot. We give them this additional money. They can now make a decision based off this this average total revenue curve that's a little bit higher than demand, right? Kind of reflecting that I've got this lump sum amount, right? So the average total revenue, as I increase the number of wins, it's just kind of decreasing that average, right? And it's approaching that demand curve. Well, we're hoping that these small market teams are win maximizing. Then they could increase wherever they were at before. So we can kind of think about this as after the revenue sharing. So if they're win maximizing, yeah, that revenue sharing program will greatly improve the competitive balance of the league, right? However, if they're profit maximizing, where marginal cost it's marginal revenue, giving them this lump sum that is the same amount no matter how many wins they get, well, it hasn't changed the marginal cost or the marginal revenue. So if they're profit maximizing this initial revenue sharing program, they're not going to change their number of wins. They're just going to pocket this additional money, right? So hopefully revenue sharing, improve competitive balance a little bit. If we have like the most extreme scenarios where small market team, doesn't make any broadcast revenue or whatever it is that's being shared, but they're profit maximizing, maybe it doesn't change anything at all. Questions on that before we keep going here? We're okay with this? All right. Is there anything else I want to say here? Okay, so let's assume I have this revenue, kind of jumping ahead a little bit. Well, let's assume I have this revenue sharing program. Okay? If I want to make sure that it impacts the small market teams, even in a scenario like this, where I know they're profit maximizing, and I want to force them to spend this money, what's something maybe that the leagues could do to ensure that those small market teams have to spend that money? I don't know if I've given you an example of it yet, but some of them have rules about whatever this revenue that's being shared is, a certain percent of it needs to go to player salaries. So what I'm assuming there is, by requiring you to get this money to spend some of it on player salaries, I've essentially I'm assuming that you're paying for better quality players and going to improve your expected wins. So to get this revenue, I have to spend a certain percent on players. What I'm kind of doing is forcing them to increase their marginal costs, right? And target a higher number of wins, right? So we can kind of think about this. This is after they institute this rule, where a certain percent of that revenue that's being shared has to go towards player salaries. Right? The team would ideally, to profit maximize, still want to target this lower number of wins, right? But the league has said, well, look, if you're spending this much, right, whatever this marginal cost per win is, we're forcing you to spend more and pushing you out this higher number of wins. So it's a little bit kind of indirect in how they're impacting the targeted wins of these teams, but they require that you spend a certain amount on salaries, unless they're just blowing it on players that don't give them any additional chance of winning, right? Which would seem kind of dumb. If I have to spend the money on the players, I might as well get the player that has the highest value, right? Or the player that I would have the highest marginal benefit to adding to my team. So by requiring the certain percent to be spent on players, we can kind of help reduce this fact that sometimes these revenue sharing programs don't work. We can make them a little bit more likely to work and improve competitive balance. Is that any questions on that idea? Because we're going to keep using it here. So let me see. So I kind of mentioned, one thing that they can do to kind of help make these revenue sharing programs better is require a certain amount of money to be spent on the players. You can also do things like set salary cap minimums, right? So that you have to spend, the minimum amount that someone can earn or a team can make that a team would pay is X, right? You could also do salary maximums, which is the next thing that we're going to talk about, and we'll kind of see how these play out. So just the idea of salary caps, right? Generally, we don't think about there being like a minimum, right? But you could create a league minimum that teams have to spend on salaries, right? A lot of leagues have set these league maximums, right? Like you can only spend $250 million or whatever on all your players, right? What that's trying to do is ensure that these large market teams don't spend way more than small market end up with a huge quality gap, right? And the large market teams are spending all this money and getting a much higher number of wins than the small market team. So we look across the different leagues. The NFL and the NHL are going to make the most sense for us when we look at this visually, because they have a hard cap, right? Now there's ways that their teams are finding to kind of get around that, but you can kind of imagine at the very least, we're trying to set an amount of money to where if you want to kind of spend past this point, it's going to become more costly. So you've got upper limits. I think these have changed a little bit because they change every single year. These are the ones that I think from last year. But the NFL also is one of the leagues that has kind of a league-wide salary minimum as well. You can't, this kind of is trying to help avoid tanking, right? So these players from like tanking for draft picks by just spending nothing on their players, we at least have to keep some, quality players to at least pay them like quality players to keep their total salary above. The NBA has kind of this luxury tax. They do have an upper limit, but you can spend past it, it just becomes costly. And then Major League Baseball, they don't have any cap, right? But they've got a luxury tax. So they really don't care if teams spend past a certain amount. It's just once you get past that amount, you have to pay the league a certain luxury tax. And then the idea would be we take that luxury tax money and share it with our smaller market teams. So what is this going to look like kind of graphically? So I think I've got, oops. Well, I guess I didn't leave a slide for us to draw this in, so I meant to. So I'll draw it up here. Let's say we want to impose kind of league-wide salary maximum minimums. What is this going to look like in our win market? How is it going to impact competitive balance? So we'll go, let's say, I'm looking at my win market. I'm going to keep marginal cost constant just to simplify. I didn't mean for this to be this far out. So there. So here's our large market team and our demand for our large market team. So marginal cost goes all the way out here. So we can kind of identify our profit and, our win and our profit maximizing points. We then have a small market team. And we know that they generate less revenue from each win, so their demand and marginal revenue curve are going to be a little bit lower. Also, is this, okay, there we go. So it's going to work similar to what I was saying with the percent of money being required to be spent on salaries. So if I've got a profit maximizing kind of small market team, one thing I could do is use a league minimum, right? The NFL. You have to spend at least $138 million. So you can think about it as, and I don't know why I wrote this as profit. Sorry, I'm trying to talk and then, right, here we go. The wins for the small market team, that's profit maximizing. So one way to think about this is like, let's say the profit maximizing kind of number of wins for the small market team, it would equate to being, requiring you to spend $100 million on your players, right? And if you spend $100 million on your players, this is the target, number of wins you'd be targeting. Well, the league comes in and says, well, look, that creates a lot of imbalance in our league. The gap, even if we've got the large market teams win maximizing as well, we've got a pretty large gap there, right? So what can we do? Well, we can say, look, you've got to spend at least, and now I forget, I think it was 138 million. So the league comes in, sets a minimum, right? And says, we're going to require that you at least spend $138 million on your players. You can say, okay, well, look, we've got to spend the money. We have to spend the money. This is what the league is saying. In order to stay in the league, we've got to spend this amount. So we spend more money on our players, which indirectly going to increase the number of expected wins that I would get. Right? So by setting these league minimums, you can think about it as, even though we're setting the amount, it would translate to a certain number of wins, right? Just like the targeted wins before translated to needing to spend a certain amount of money on my players. Okay? So these league minimums kind of forcing these teams who might be profit maximizing, kind of push them past that point. Questions on that idea before I keep going here? Now, what's one problem with this? If I'm targeting these league minimums, let's say I thought the team was profit maximizing, but that they were actually win maximizing. So if I think about where this win maximizing team would be, let's say instead, I'm kind of putting this on the same graph. I'm just going to get a little bit messy, but stay with me for a second. Let's say instead that they actually were win maximizing when they were spending $100 million. Well, now when I have my league minimum up there, I can kind of think about 138 would have to be somewhere over here. So if I impose the league minimum like this, where they were already previously win maximizing, what's going to happen to this team? Yeah, remember, this was the point where profits were zero. If I then make them increase, right, if they were at that point, I make them spend more, well, the marginal revenue that those players are going to generate is way below the marginal cost of those players. They're actually going to see an even further reduction in profits, negative profits, if they actually did spend that amount of money. Right? So if we incorrectly set these league minimums to be above these win maximizing points for some of the small market teams, we would actually eventually drive teams out of the league if it got bad enough. Now, do I think they're anywhere near that? No. I think they've probably done a pretty good, I'm sure they have teams of people when they set these who have estimated kind of went around, looked at the actual financials of the teams to figure out where can we set this that makes sense, right? We want to figure out, can we set it somewhere in this range, right? If these teams were completely profit maximizing versus completely win maximizing, we want to kind of increase that league minimum to get closer and closer to that win maximizing point for our small market teams. We'll go too far, bad things happen. Okay. Questions on that idea before we keep moving here? So the next one, hopefully, isn't too wild to or figure out from what we just did. So I'm going to keep this one a little more simple. Here's our small market team. We'll keep them way down here. Let's just assume they're profit maximizing for the sake of this example. I then have my large market team. And let's assume, just to make the extreme point, that they're win maximizing. Okay. So I've got this pretty big gap, right? This pretty big quality gap between my large and small market teams. I could also set kind of these maximums, right? The team can only spend this amount of money on its players, right? You can't spend past this point. So similar idea, whatever this number of wins, this might translate to a certain amount of money, right? So maybe if I spend, the large market team spends $250 million on their players and coaches, whatever, that would target that number of wins. So if I want them to target a lower number of wins, I've got to say you can't spend that much. So the league comes in and says maybe we're going to put a cap, or think about this as a league maximum, right? Or a league kind of total salary cap, where they can't spend the amount of money they'd like to in order to win maximize. They're going to have to spend less, kind of indirectly forcing them to target a lower number of wins, right? So you can imagine we could use a combination too, minimums and maximums, kind of pushing these teams so that the gap in wins is going to be smaller and smaller. Okay. Questions on this before we keep going? Okay with this? I think there's anything else I want to say here. So we've got this idea of salary maximums and minimums. Go back here. So, and to be honest, it's a little bit different in different leagues, but I'll kind of use the NBA as an example. That even though we have, so the NBA has kind of this soft cap, right? That there is a salary cap, but you can spend over that if the various kind of circumstances are as follows. So there's a mid-level exception, right? So you pay a player a certain amount, that player's salary goes towards the salary cap. Well, the NBA has kind of realized, like, we want to allow, we set this cap, maybe we've kind of forced some of these small market teams, like if they are win maximizing, they can't actually push past that point, right? So I was drawing the large and small market marginal revenue curves very far from each other. If they were closer to each other, you can imagine that potentially the win maximizing point for small market team is greater than the profit maximizing point for large market teams, right? If those are a little bit closer together. So they want to allow these small market teams to still spend a little bit more money if they're willing to win maximize. So they have this cap, but then if you've got what? A player and you sign them at the average salary of the league, that doesn't count towards your salary cap, right? So you can add one player at the league average salary, and then that player's money doesn't go against your cap, right? You also have rookie exceptions. So I don't remember all of these. We'll just kind of put them all up here because they're all a little bit different. The rookie exception is if you've got the rookie sign their first contract and that pushes you over the cap, that's not going to count against you as well, right? And then you've got what, the Larry Bird one. This is like if you re-sign a player that was already on the roster, it's not going to add more to that salary cap. It's not going to count against it. If you've got, I think this is Derek Rose, this one was something about performance, right? Yeah, so like if you get, you're coming off a rookie contract, it wasn't that none of it goes against the cap, but a lower percent goes against it if that was a high quality player. Right? So, and then I think the last one was something about, if you win not just MVP, but these different amounts, you can add that player, not their entire contract doesn't count against it. So what this is trying to do, especially these last two, is allow for teams to kind of spend past that point, right, and kind of try to win maximize a little bit more. You can also imagine how else could this improve competitive balance?
If a small market team has one of those players, they can keep it.
Yeah, it's trying to keep these players on smaller market teams, right? It's trying to keep these players, so it's essentially changing the cost, right? If I'm a large market team, right, and I don't have that player, right, to add them is not just, I have a much higher percent of that money that goes against my salary cap, and I can spend, have less money to spend on other players. So they're trying to kind of keep players with these smaller markets by making it essentially lower cost to the teams that already have them, right? Now this also kind of assumes, like, when I say small market, you're assuming that the smaller market end up lower quality, so they end up with higher draft picks, so they end up with more of these like kind of rookies and things that they're actually then able to kind of have a little bit more of a chance of keeping, right, of holding on to. Now, if you've got high quality, large markets that have some down years and then end up with these players, this could also benefit large market teams as well, right? So this is kind of valuable when you get these rookies to really get it right in the NBA, because once you've got them, there are rules where if they end up being good players, less of their money goes against the salary cap, and you actually kind of have a lower cost of keeping that player than other teams would have of adding them. Is that making sense where that idea comes from? So kind of interesting with the NBA. So the other thing we can think about are luxury taxes. So I think we should be able to get through that. I use the NBA as an example, but the MLB has their own system. I'll kind of maybe start with that in the next class, but I want to kind of go through the model of what this would look like visually. So if you go certain amounts over the cap, you still have to pay a luxury tax. So even, this is kind of the idea of a soft cap. That some of that money doesn't go against that hard salary cap, but you would still have to pay a percent on, right? You're still going past that point. So there's a luxury tax of if I spend less than $5 million over that, for every dollar I spend, essentially I'm having to pay $1.50, right? I'm having to pay 50 cents into the league. And then if I'm in between 5 and 10, the dollar, the tax, instead of just paying every single dollar, it goes up to, I'm giving 75 cents to the league, right? 75 cents on the dollar, and then so on and so forth. And then, you can kind of see, if you get to these really large amounts, incrementally increasing. If you repeat, right, repeatedly go over this cap year after year, the amount goes up, right? So they're really trying to make sure teams don't, have to, if they want to go over this cap, they got to spend a lot more money, right? So what this is going to look like is, and we will just draw a large market team to kind of make the point for today. So we've got my marginal costs, got my demand for the large market team, marginal revenue. So this is what it would look like without a salary cap. Sorry, a salary cap. Without a salary cap, but also without a luxury tax, right? So let's just assume that these large market teams are win maximizing, okay? So why do we see teams sometimes spending over this cap, even repeatedly, and paying these much higher costs? Well, essentially what the luxury tax does is, whatever the marginal cost was before, the new marginal cost is that cost of acquiring talent plus this additional tax, right? So before, every additional unit of talent I was adding, I was spending $1. Now, for every dollar I spend, I also have to pay 75 cents to the league. My total cost is $1.75. So you can think about it as there's a certain point, right, that would equate to wherever that cap is they set, or like once you hit this cap, like you got to pay a luxury tax past this point. If I want to continue to target a higher number of wins, I want to spend past that cap, I now have to pay this higher marginal cost plus that additional tax, right? So it's kind of weird because we've got this constant marginal cost, but taxes, right, decrease our supply curve or kind of shift them up into the left. Weird with a horizontal marginal cost, but really, you think about it, all a tax does is add to your marginal costs. So once you hit that cap, you got to start paying that luxury tax. So now, once I'm paying this luxury tax, where's the number of wins they're going to target? Well, now marginal cost hits my demand curve down here. So even if I'm win maximizing, and we'll call this LT for luxury tax, number of wins, you can kind of see that luxury tax will reduce the number of wins that these large market teams target, but they still may find it beneficial, right? Especially if they're win maximizing, they still might spend, right, past that cap, right? They're going to spend a certain amount of money over the cap until they hit that point where profits are zero now, right? So it's not as high as it was before, but they still may choose to spend over that cap. And what's nice is if they've paid this luxury tax, and some of that luxury tax is then shared with the rest of the league, well, now by imposing that tax, I was able to reduce the large market teams' wins, If I then throw in the average total revenue curve, if I've got any type of win maximizing behavior going on with the small market teams, some of them will kind of increase their target number of wins, improving competitive balance really on both ends with this luxury tax. Questions on that? And like the MBA's one, it just becomes more complicated because like there's a certain amount. Then if I spend 5 million over, would jump up, another 5 jump up, right? You can just imagine there'll just be more of these steps, right? But you get the idea with just one. All right, so I think there's should be good on that. I think we'll touch on luxury taxes again next class. So I think I wanted to point 2 things out. So one, so I have, you'll see a couple of today. I've graded all of your first homeworks. One thing that I kind of noticed, the universal issue is make sure you're being very detailed in your answers. Read the questions carefully. Don't forget to answer certain parts of things. Usually some questions will have 3 or 4 things I ask you for. If I ask you for price, quantity, and total revenue, and you just tell me about price and quantity, you know, I have to mark you off for not saying anything about total revenue. I would also mention that anytime you have shifts or things occurring, always think about this, and we've talked about it in the examples in class, but the size of the shift often matters, right? So probably it's a little bit frustrating in economics because the answer usually is it depends, right? So when I'm kind of leaving things open where I'm not telling you the size of these shifts, you need to kind of mention, you know, if I saw a small decrease in demand, maybe quantity doesn't change at all. If I see a large one, maybe it decreases or whatever the scenario is, right? So making sure you think about all the possible scenarios from whatever this changes and kind of mentioning all of them, right? So I'll get the second homework up there this afternoon. I also took some time yesterday to really try to make sure I'm phrasing the questions I'm asking you specifically for things. I'm probably also going to ask you for more graphs because that's another thing I noticed is when I asked you for a graph, a lot of you did pretty decent. But if I asked you for a graph or to explain it, most people chose to explain it and they didn't do as well as the people who chose to kind of use a graph to help kind of depict or explain their answer, right? So I'll ask you probably for a lot more graphs on that second homework just to ensure that you're trying to connect it with something that we kind of look at in class. And I think it goes up to the last question is going to be stuff that we talked about today. All right. So I'll give you a few days. It's going to be like 2 weeks from today. So you'll have quite a bit of time to work on it, but it's all going to be material we've already covered. So you can really start going at it and kind of get questions to me as you're working on it. Okay. All right. Also, we'll have some questions for iClickers on Friday about the paper. So make sure you at least kind of read through that main idea, look at the data, look at what the variables they use are. And yeah, I'll see you guys on Friday.